February 2nd, 2026. It's year 4, day 344, since the full-scale invasion began. Welcome. For the situation report, in today's report we see very interesting geolocations in the area around Kopiansk, various territorial gains and attacks in supposedly secure areas, and much more. On January 27th, I mentioned another phantom capture in my situation report. The chief of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, declared the village of Kopiansk-Muslovy as fully captured. This is the place that was marked here on the situation map. However, he couldn't provide any evidence for it. In turn, I showed him the latest geolocations on the map, which are still marked here from both sides, and thus disproved his statement. Now, others are doing the same as I did, because here, the Ukrainian battalion commander Roman Kovalev reports to us from exactly this section and sends another very real, sign of life. Gerasimov and his army, this time together with the soldiers Anton and Alexei, both of whom are Russian soldiers who were captured here. The video was recorded today at the Green Pin, so right here in the very center of the village. The report is less of a military surprise and more of another example of how far apart Russian situation reports and the actual front line are. But that's the case in an army that gets punished if it doesn't achieve any gains. So they simply make them up and report them, and each level does the same, adding a few more villages or kilometers. And Gerasimov and Putin are happy in the end because they think they've made big gains, but those gains don't actually exist. By the way, in the last press conferences, he reported the place has captured 3 times and has liberated 5 times, just because the place wasn't actually taken. It's not that there's no fighting here. In this video, for example, we see Ukrainian soldiers fighting for control inside a building. The whole thing took place here at the blue pin, so a bit further north from the video message and even further north here at the yellow pin. 3 days ago, Russian soldiers were spotted and engaged by a drone. So let's take a look at the geolocation over the past few days. We see a lot of confusion here. We can see that from the last situation report, especially these 4 red ones and this yellow pin here. There were different things to see there. On one hand, Russian soldiers. On the other hand, Ukrainian soldiers. The villages are neither really controlled nor lost. It's a mix of both. We keep seeing soldiers from both sides in there, and we see few fights. Often it's only drone footage that gives a brief glimpse into the situation here. Additionally, the last time we also saw that a Russian flag was raised here. That was on the day when I also saw the one that Gerasimov refuted. And now we see 3 more quite interesting geolocations. As I said, here is one with a firefight, and up here Russian soldiers. These 2 were taken before recording. A Ukrainian battalion commander in the town center films himself with 2 captured Russian soldiers. This shows we have another patchwork situation. We can see that Russian soldiers are mostly operating in the town's northern part. As I mentioned, this is a Russian position where I'm fighting Russian soldiers. At the blue pin and above, a drone spotted Russian soldiers. Below, we've captured some. There's nothing left there. There's almost no geolocation toward the water or Ostgil. This is also the southernmost I found. I assume that the Russians are mostly located here in the north of this river, which runs right through the village. In some cases, they advanced or tried to move further into the city. So there's a lot of chaos, hardly a clear front line. It's more or less always small sabotage groups fighting each other here and trying to establish a foothold somewhere. Looking a bit further north at Pianzi, there's also a very interesting geolocation marked by the red pin. A successful sabotage and reconnaissance operation was reported here. A unit of the Freedom of Russia Legion operated about 7 kilometers deep in Russian-controlled territory, according to their own statement. The target was a fortified position that was used by Russian forces both as an ammunition depot and as a gathering and rotation point for infantry, and it played an important role in supplying the unit around Kopiansk. Since the use of long-range effects was not possible due to the distance and limited radio range, the physical destruction of the target was ordered. The unit covertly entered the rear area, attacked the position directly, and neutralize the Russian soldiers present. Captured communication equipment will now be used for further reconnaissance. The ammunition depot was destroyed, and the unit reported everyone returned safely. What makes this noteworthy? Some Ukrainian forces can clearly penetrate deep into Russian territory and conduct sabotage operations. We've also seen the same on the Russian side, slightly further south. We also see isolated Russian soldiers who manage to penetrate deep into supposedly Ukrainian-controlled territory. That means on both sides, it's mainly sabotage groups operating here on a large scale. So it also confirms that there is no clear front line anymore, and small groups can move around more or less unhindered. The statement also clarifies that the Russians were to control a 7-kilometer area around the destroyed camp. Since we know that the Ukrainians are definitely here in the blue-controlled area, that is in the west of Oskil, it hardly makes any sense to me. Because if we measure it, we see that 7 kilometers is a lot. It's 5 kilometers to the center of Kopiansk, and 7 would mean about the spot where Zelensky was photographed during the liberation of Kopiansk. But 7 kilometers could also mean in this direction here. But that would also mean that the Russians have controlled or are currently controlling this village. 7 kilometers would also be up to the geolocations we just had down here, or 7 kilometers could also mean up here a bit further, roughly to the dotted line. But I can't imagine that a sabotage group would attack from the northwest and then still have to cross the East Keel to get here. I assume they came from around level 116. They began at the Mechanized Brigade and advanced north. That's why I assume that 7 kilometers is probably an exaggeration by the Russian Freedom Legion. Looking at my map and pretty much every other situation map, I don't see any clear line of Russian-controlled territory within 7 kilometers either. But what about territorial gains in general? Deep State reports Russia captured 245 square kilometers in January. That's about half the gains from September of last year, and indicates a noticeable slowdown in Russian advances. But winter and its conditions aren't entirely to blame for this. About a third of all Russian attacks along the front were concentrated at Pokrovsk. In second place was Huliajpol, with about 21%, where the number of attacks there has almost doubled compared to the previous year. The area around Sloviansk is also striking. Although only 3% of the attacks took place there, about 20% of the territorial gains were made in this section. This shows that individual local breakthroughs, despite overall low attack intensity, can have a disproportionate effect. A Russian TOS-One. A system was destroyed on Russian territory for the first time since the war began. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade struck it in Belgorod Oblast. This is quite remarkable because this heavy thermobaric multiple rocket launcher unit has so far been used almost exclusively on Ukrainian territory. The reason for this is that it has a rather short range of only 6 to 12 kilometers, depending on the type of ammunition used. The Ukrainians use drones to quickly find and attack after a TOS strike, and so a TOS-One rocket launcher with its more or less exposed ammunition storage is simply an extreme weak point for a drone. The thing usually explodes immediately. But since then, they haven't been used as often as about 3 years ago. The incident also shows that Russian high-value systems are now vulnerable and unsafe even on their own territory. Putin recently announced a 1-week halt on attacking civilian targets in Kiev. However, Russia is not offering a ceasefire, but merely a short pause in attacks on Kiev, and that too with a lot of media hype. Meanwhile, evidence is mounting that the Russian army faces major problems. Reports indicate that severely wounded soldiers, often lacking limbs or prosthetics, are repeatedly sent back to the front, as frequently noted in last year's situation reports. After heavy losses, the Kremlin is using all remaining options. Prisoners, mercenaries, especially foreign fighters. I've never seen so many Africans as this year, even some still wounded. Despite these sacrifices, the army makes little progress. For months, many people have been lost for little territory. Sometimes the front advances just a few dozen meters a day. Situation reports reflect this, with territorial gains rarely exceeding a row of trees. As people face inflation and economic strain, resources keep going to rockets, drones, and a war of attrition with no clear end in sight. Against this background, peace talks should not be seen as a reward for Russia. If there is ever a moment when pressure can work, it is now. Real peace happens only if the aggressor is forced to yield, not by making more concessions, as the United States has tried for a long time. I've been saying this since 2023 with no change, thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the Albu crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renica, Robert Ziller, Dietrich Bredy, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, and comment. See you in the next report.